Okay.
Got it.
Good morning, everyone. So were you a little more comfortable with this chapter?
Yes.
I hope so. As a matter of fact, what I'd like to do is start with the very last paragraph.
Would you?
So on page 92, the last paragraph is, we began this part of the book by asking whether distancing God from the world would empty religion of meaning by making God entirely inaccessible and unapproachable to human beings. We have found instead that the Rambam's conception of the transcendent God makes possible a new vision of religious life in which God's greatness does not belittle and infantilize, but rather empowers and elevates. Any thoughts on simply that paragraph? Rambam's conception of a transcendent God makes possible a new vision of religious life in which God's greatness does not belittle and infantilize, but rather empowers and elevates. I think it's a great quotation. If we don't have people that are either cheering or complaining, let me explore, what went on in this chapter, and we're finishing the whole issue of Rambam on God.
That's good.
He begins with Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hutchins, who are anti-religion altogether. And he finally gets to Karen Armstrong, and he uses this word, apophatic. Anybody hear that word before?
Never.
I certainly hadn't heard the word before, apophatic, so I had to look it up. And it is the knowledge of God obtained through negation. Apophatic. You can impress all of your friends by using that word, and I guarantee you they've never heard it before.
He's talking.
Yeah.
So that's what he says. What Karen Armstrong focuses on, an approach to an apophatic approach to religion, where faith not as something people thought, but actually something people did. I was surprised at that quotation, because that sounds very Jewish to me. And usually a distinction that I make between Judaism and Christianity is that Judaism is focused on mitzvah, on what people do, while overwhelmingly, as a very general statement, Christianity is focused on faith and belief. That she advocates a deliberate, principled reticence about God, which is exactly what Maimonides says. Maimonides respects the limits of what can meaningfully be said about God, which is negative theology. Okay. That he recasts with his negative theology and his transcendent God. He recasts beliefs about prophecy, providence, and redemption. So again, as a review of those three chapters, who is the prophet? A prophet is not someone who God happens to choose, but a prophet is someone who is perfectly endowed with intellect and imagination, education, and moral training, who achieves the position by virtue of the prophetic status. We may have talked about this before. What's the problem with this definition? The problem with this definition, seems to me, is that's not a description of the biblical prophets. The guy, I guess that's most familiar to us is or easiest access is Jonah. we don't have the sense that Jonah is an intellectual, that he is endowed with intellect and imagination, education and moral training. And we're not told about Jonah's background at all. He's just some guy. Providence is protection, providence being rewarding the good and punishing the evil. This is protection, which is achieved through study and spiritual refinement, which leads to reforms in our desires from material to spiritual, so that we appreciate providence when we are no longer dependent on the physical world. It's a whole redefinition. It's a redefinition not of God, but of the human being. And finally, redemption, which we usually think of as the discussion about the Messiah. Humans are, rather than the Messiah being someone who comes, but humans are active rather than passive participants. Redemption comes through a yearning for wisdom, where we displace our desires for money, power, and for money and power, and in that way, which leads to reducing war, refocusing from human yearnings, from the physical to the intellectual and spiritual. You get the theme. There's a whole theme that runs through this. Yeah, Lisa, you're muted.
I guess the one thing that, I think at the beginning of this, when we first started this class, you talked about a little bit about the Hasidic movement trying to bring joy and warmth back into Judaism. And this seems very ascetic. And except that it's Judaism, not Christianity, he could be a monk arguing this, that I'm going to spend my life in intellectual pursuits, negating the physical. And I think, I agree also with you that he doesn't recognize the role of the prophets or who they were portrayed to be in the Torah and in the other writings. But the continuation of that is this sort of ascetic ideal that is very different than what we've learned, at least what I learned in Judaism, which was the sexual act is something to be treasured, not just something for procreation, that it's a mitzvah, and the warmth that goes along with being Jewish. And so I can imagine this might work for him, but I can't imagine this approach would work for most people.
Well, he is speaking, remember, he's an elitist. He is speaking to a particular audience, a particular elite, educated, philosophically knowledgeable audience. And it doesn't sound like a lot of fun. You're right. He's although at the end of this section, it is one experiences God through the natural world, which sounds actually very much like the Baal Shem Tov, who walk out and experience God by walking out into the forest and experiencing God through nature, but also through dance, through music, through all these other kinds of experiences. It's in theory it is very sterile. As a matter of fact, the next section he talks about is the conservation of Eros, in which he says human beings were born with a desire to know, to acquire knowledge, which tends to diminish with age because our desire to know is crowded out by our physical desires. When Eros is captured by the senses, intellectual desire decreases, strengthening the intellectual yearning weakens, strengthening intellectual yearning, in other words, fighting against that decreasing, it weakens sexual desire. And people surprised by his discussion about circumcision, what the purpose of circumcision is. Circumcision
Ouch.
was circumcision. Its purpose was to lessen sexual desire and strengthen the desire for knowledge. Now, there's no text that says that. It's not. It's certainly not in the Torah. It's not in other texts. And he goes on, sexuality is a necessary evil for the continuation of human life, but it detracts from the from life's true purpose. And we should reduce that passion as much as possible. And it should be done in secret. Feel sorrowful. I was really surprised at that. Sorrowful and not speak about it, right? But he says the desire for knowledge and sexuality are the same. And therefore the conservation of Eros, our author says, is also the urges for food, for resources, for political power. Does that sound Jewish to you? It's Jewish because it comes from Maimonides. Trudy?
It doesn't sound Jewish to me because on the Bima, Rabbi Greenstein, when he was there, said it's a mitzvah to have sex on Shabbat.
What? Well, no, I go further. It's a mitzvah to have sex, and I think people would say what the source of that is. I don't know. Is a double mitzvah on Shabbat, but
okay.
David, you're muted.
David's muted.
That's his problem. He'll figure it out.
He's talking.
You're muted, so we can't hear you, David. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
All right. We've raised before the demarcation of this book, and I think that Maimonides is trying outwardly to square the circle, and he can't do it. The desire to learn, the thirst for knowledge that was just quoted, is almost verbatim from Aristotle. And
Sure.
Aristotle talks about a life that's very different from that of a Jew who pursues the mitzvot. Aristotle certainly doesn't subscribe to revelation, and revelation is critical to Judaism, especially in the 13th century.
Well, that's why we're going to Torah next, because that's going to deal with Revelation.
I just don't think he succeeds in. He's addressing two audiences. He says, and there's a long history of interpretation about his esotericism. To whom is this book addressed? And my 2 cents is that it's addressed to people who want to pursue a philosophical life. And I think at the end, I think there's an acknowledgement that there's no logical way to reconcile the philosophical life with the life predicated upon revelation.
Well, that's the conflict. That's the conflict, and we really haven't dealt with revelation at all. But that's this whole section on Torah is, of course, what are we going to do about revelation? How are we going to square that circle? What's the expression? How are we going to do where Aristotle, of course, doesn't deal with revelation, or he denies revelation because he's focused entirely on reason. Maimonides is not going to negate revelation, but he's going to reinterpret revelation. This is so this is simply Aristotle believes in God, or deals with a certain kind of God, and so Maimonides can buy into Aristotle's God. Even so, he has to deal with these concepts. So he's very much still with Aristotle, but the next section, of course, is going to be difficult. So Jennifer, did you want to add something?
Actually, it was me, but it's kind of
I
building on David's.
got the wrong hand.
Yeah, well, she was closer. So it's kind of the continuation of how important his interpretations were relative, or in the context of using philosophy. And there's a sentence from page 88. I just wanted to read it and kind of get your thoughts on it. Unlike the Midrashic tradition, which promoted the plurality of possible meanings in the biblical text, for the Rambam, after a philosophical view was established as certain, only readings of the Torah that conformed with that view were possible. What does it mean to say that philosophical concepts were established as certain? Who establishes them with certainty?
Well, of course, are the certainties of the time. These are the certainties that begin with Aristotle and now have percolated, and they are established in the Muslim philosophical development. So, I mean, he talks about that a little later, in which he says God's incorporeality is an absolute, right? Is an absolute philosophical concept. We're certain about that. Now, how he can be so certain is, but it's established. Whereas our author poses that in contradiction to the whole idea of whether the world is eternal or not, or whether the world was created. That's not philosophically established. So he could fudge on that. But so in other words, he starts with certain, we do the same thing. We start with certain ideas about race, about equality. Now we've added to it issues of gender identity. And we superimpose that now on an ancient faith, because these are the truths of our time. They may be eternal truths, but they are, and we now impose it on the text, so that we take, for instance, those two verses in Leviticus that seemingly are a prohibition on same-sex relations. And now we say, well, wait, let's look at that verse. Let's look at it closely. Let's look at it very closely. Maybe we can limit that prohibition to so that it's not so general. And because we start with a, it's not a philosophical truth, it's an ideological or political truth. And now well, that's what he's doing. He's starting with philosophical truths. So far, the only one that we've dealt with is God's incorporeality. You start there, and now you have to go back to the text and say, what do you mean? We have all kinds of texts that talk about God's strong arm, and God is described with all kinds of human characteristics in the Bible. Well, what he did with it is what we do with it. We say it's metaphor. We say that human language is limited, and therefore the biblical text used the language that it could possibly use. Now, hundreds of years before Maimonides, maybe 1,000 years before Maimonides, what did they really believe about these ideas? We read when Isaiah is called a prophecy. I think it's chapter 6 of Isaiah. Isaiah has a vision of seeing God sitting on a throne with angels surrounding him, and praise. Well, what are we supposed to do with that image? It really sounds like, God sits there like a king on a throne. Well, we dismiss it. That's metaphor. That was how he could describe his experience, but he really didn't see God sitting on a throne. But in Isaiah's day, what did they believe? How did they understand that text? So I think we do the same thing, and I think what's courageous about Isaiah, courageous about Maimonides, is how non-literal he is. How he feels free to say, this is what the text says, but I don't care what it says. That's not what it means. So he starts with his philosophical concepts, and now he's going to impose them and say that's what the text really is all about, or how we should understand it today. Which leads us directly to the section where he gets to interpreting the Torah. And the authority of reason. So we have reinterpreted verses to affirm God's incorporeality any place where it appears that God is not incorporeal, does not have a physical body. Don't believe the written text. It's all metaphor. So there's a strong gap between the simple reading of the text and Rambam's interpretation. So Rambam's prophets are different from the biblical prophets. God interferes with the laws of nature in the Bible, and miracles, and we have miracles where the wicked are punished, the righteous are rewarded, without regard to anything having to do with the intellect or with education. And Maimonides rejects all of that. We read these stories. Korach, it gets swallowed up by the earth. The Israelites wander through the Red Sea in a miraculous, and then the sea covers up and kills the Egyptians. So there is an ancient sense that one's experience of God, or the experience that human beings can have of God, is where God interferes with nature, and Maimonides rejects that entirely. that's not how one experiences God. And what he does with these miracles, I don't know if he says that all these miracles are metaphor, but he doesn't choose to interpret the text as that's how one experiences God. So our author goes into the in contrast to the references to God's body parts, which he rejects, to the issue of was the world created or eternal, and he comes to the conclusion that there's no decisive proof one way or the other, but there's a stronger argument for creation. So he's not saying the world was created. He's saying I can't choose which one, but in amassing all the arguments pro and con about creation, there's a stronger argument for creation. So he's not, interestingly, not stuck with the literalness, with the literalist reading of the text. He has interpretive freedom, which our author says is not new. We have others. Philo talked about metaphor, and we have this whole midrashic tradition. How old was Isaac when Abraham took him to sacrifice him? Right, and we get to one interpretation that he must have been 37 years old. How do we get the idea, which changes the entire story? How do we get to 37 years old? Well, the first thing that happens after the Akedah, after the binding of Isaac, is we read about the fact that Sarah dies. Sarah dies at the age of 127. So the Midrash puts the two together and says, Abraham did not tell Sarah what he was going to do. When Sarah found out what he was going to sacrifice his son, Sarah had a heart attack, or Sarah died. Well, if Sarah was 90 when Isaac was born, she dies at 127. These two events are connected. Therefore, Isaac must have been 37 years old. Where when you read the story, it appears, if you're simple reading of the story, that you're dealing with a kid. You're dealing with an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old kid. So what is new is not that interpretive freedom, but what's new is his own consciousness of doing it. He is free to interpret against the plain sense of the text. But you may only, but he limits that. You may only reinterpret a text when there's decisive proof. And he's talking about not physical proof, but philosophical proof. And therefore, where there is proof, philosophical proof of God's incorporeality, he's at ease with writing off any reference to God having a physical body. But since in the issue of creation, where there's no decisive philosophical proof, he'll argue both sides, and it appears in this case come down on the biblical side that the world was created. So how does one know when the words are used metaphorically? And he says one knows when, by the context, with knowledge of cultural and intellectual context. So that's very modern. In other words, he's saying when was this text written? Well, traditionally, it was all written by the Torah was all traditionally written by Moses, except for the last 6 words. It was all traditionally written by Moses, the last six sentences or so. And he's saying, there is a cultural and intellectual context, and he's sort of on the line that the text may not be entirely from Moses. So he starts with a philosophical truth and then reinterprets the text. He's not imposing philosophy on the Torah, says our author, but philosophy enables us to reveal the Torah's teaching. So you have to begin with the truth. And I would suggest that we often do the same thing when we interpret the text, because we are not literalists. We do not believe that the world was 6,000 years old, that it was created in 6 days, that somehow God planted evidence of dinosaurs to confuse us. We don't believe that, because we begin with truths as well. And truths that we begin with are often scientific truths, not philosophical truths, but scientific truths. So in that last section, that last couple of pages, he says, man or human beings, rather than being a victim or subject of divine will, we have control. That the prophet is not somebody who sits and waits for God, but one who trains and educates himself. And so now he compares Nietzsche, who said that the precondition for a free, autonomous human being is emancipation from God, from faith, from religion. And for Maimonides, the hero is not Nietzsche's rebel, but God's transcendence makes space for our creativity. So it's coming to the same conclusion by completely different means. God doesn't reveal himself through great miracles, but and this I thought was very beautiful near the end. But God's wisdom is revealed in everyday workings of nature. Here he sounds very much like Heschel, or Heschel sounds very much like the Rambam. That to experience God is not to expect any sort of miraculous change in the natural order, but to appreciate awe and wonder, which is that when we do is a profound religious experience. the constant search for the supernatural. I thought this was pretty powerful. The constant search for the supernatural, in other words, the breaking of the natural order, is an expression of psychological disability. You sort of follow that? Those who are expecting a miracle. I mean, the rabbi said, you know, when Abraham sends his servant Eliezer to find a wife for Isaac, Eliezer comes to the well, and he prays to God for God to somehow show him who he should pick. And the rabbis actually have great trouble with that verse, because what is being asked for, Eliezer is standing there and he says, God, do a miracle for me. Well, we don't ask for those kinds of miracles, though by tradition there's a sense that miracles, breaking the natural order, does happen. But here, where people believe that it's the miraculous that is proof of the supernatural, Maimonides says it's an expression of psychological disability. You don't need these miracles in order to know that God exists, or to experience God. It's all around you. Just go outside and look. I'm told when I came to the seminary in 1971, and in 1972, Heschel died. So I remember Heschel wandering through the dining room. He wasn't that old, but he looked old. But one of the things he evidently did was send students, when it was snowing in New York, outside to experience the miracle of snow, to just appreciate what was happening. This is, Heschel's description of God. One could appreciate through this sense of wonder, and it's very much what our author is describing as the centerpiece of Maimonides. So again, let me look at that last sentence, which I read at the beginning. We began this part of the book by asking whether distancing God from the world would empty religion of meaning by making God entirely inaccessible and unapproachable to human beings. We have found instead that the Rambam's conception of a transcendent God makes possible a new vision of religious life, in which God's greatness does not belittle and infantilize, but rather empowers and elevates. God's greatness does not belittle and infantilize. So to prove that God exists by showing the miraculous is belittling God and infantilizing. Infantilizing, I don't know, infantilizing us or infantilizing God. That's not how one should experience God. I was very, while I had a lot of questions about these previous chapters, I loved this chapter. We have any, Lisa? You're mute, so you have to open up.
So I guess I have a couple questions. So when I listen to all this, and I'm sort of going back to, I think David sort of raised the question, who's the audience, right? Or maybe you did. And so Maimonides lived in Spain, but had to flee to Morocco or Egypt, correct?
He first to Fez and then to Egypt. Yes.
Yeah. And so there was some persecution then. So in a way, I listened to this, not that I disagree with all of it, but in a way, he's trying to give agency to Jews. I just imagine a situation of persecution and saying to Jews, look, if you interpret it this way, you have agency to rise above the pain of your existence. So that was one thing that I wondered
Okay.
about.
That's very nice. I like that.
Yeah. And the other part was, I was wondering about it in the context of the communities in which he lived. It seems like this approach to an undefinition of God, right? Saying I can't define God, is very distinct from a medieval Christian viewpoint. And I wondered, how does it differentiate with, or how is it congruent with the Muslim viewpoint about God, which I don't know. I don't know anything about that. So those were my sort of comments and questions.
I would guess from having his early life in Muslim Spain, and then going to Muslim Fez and winding up in Muslim Egypt, that the Muslim philosophical school was very, very influential on him. And he may not have had any knowledge of or connection to the Christian philosophical world, because the Muslim philosophical world was much at this time much more intellectually advanced than oops, I lost everybody again. Let me see if I can find you again. There you are. So I would guess that this was what he was hearing, learning. He was fluent in Arabic. That these were the ideas in the Arab and the Muslim philosophical context. Would be my guess. Any other thoughts?
Easy.
Judy?
I guess I had in the end of it all, I feel like he's saying if you're not a true intellectual, then you're not really Jewish, or you're not
Can't grasp it.
we're not at the level that we should be. And that when he said Holocaust wasn't as important as intellect, I just had trouble with the whole thing.
I'm not sure he says that halakha is not important after all.
Well, he says it's not as important. He said that somewhere that it's important, but it's more important to be reaching for God and putting aside all these things that people want out of life. And I don't know where that was.
I mean, his, it's not like Martin Buber, who was a important philosopher who had much more impact on the Christian world than on the Jewish world. Martin Buber was totally unobservant. For Maimonides, the two go really hand in hand. Observance and so I'm not sure that he would say that halakha is not important.
I didn't say it wasn't important, but that reaching the
But
higher is more important.
But certainly in at the same time, while you are practicing your Jewish goal should be intellectual development.
Mhm.
Alan?
So I think he's, very contemporary in his approach to this. Harold Schulweis, Olive Shalom, I mean, his thing was when you say a blessing, you end it through me. It's me that is going to be godly. It's me that is going to make the blessing come to fruition. And to a large extent, that's a very Maimonidean principle, because in Maimonides' view, this is all about intellectual perfection to where you are able to live the type of life that the Torah commands of us. His definition of perfection may be a little off from contemporary means, but his way of contextualizing how to do God, I mean, this is not Tevia's God, right? Tevia is looking up to God. Why do you do this to me? Why do you bring? No, he doesn't believe in any of that. And if you think about contemporary Judaism, even in Orthodox circles, they go away from saying God is somehow responsible for that, because you can't explain the Holocaust. And so it required a rethinking by our people, post Holocaust. He was going through much the same type of trauma in his life. And I'm sure it influenced him to say, I can't look up to God and say, make my life better. I've got to make my life better. So I think it's very contemporary.
Right. And I think contemporary in that we are, to some degree, and maybe he was too, unaware of the assumptions that we bring when we read the text. You remember after 9/11, there was this whole thing of looking into Islam. And people said, the Quran is a book of violence. Well, there is violence in the Quran, but Muslims don't see the Quran as a book of violence, because they come to it with some preconceived notion. Now you look at the Bible, look at the book of Joshua. It is a violent book. It is really, it's a violent text. But when Jews think of the Torah, we don't think of it as a book of violence, because we bring to it ideas even before we begin. And then we read the text, and we read the text in terms of what we believe before we even got there. Based on your, I'm wondering, as you were, Alan, as you were talking before, of being me-centered, my thought was to the blessing that we say over bread. We say hamotzi lechem min haaretz. We say God who brought forth wheat from the earth. We say we thank God who brings forth bread from the earth. Well, God does not bring forth bread. I've never seen a field with bread, right? So it's we who create the bread, because you can't eat the wheat the way it is. It has to be, we have to do something with it. We create food out of the, so it's, we thank God, praised are you God, our God, King of the universe, who hamotzi lechem min haaretz, who brings forth bread from the earth, which is not true. But that's the blessing, and it's a blessing that certainly one of the very first blessings that we teach our children. Barbara?
Yeah, so I love the part also about the God's greatness, and it doesn't belittle it or infantilize, because I really think that the interpretation, and I mean that means us being infantilized, not God, because the interpretation of all the miracles and God will do this, and I pray to God for this and that, and all of that stuff to me is infantilization, and which is why I have so much trouble with all that. I mean, seeing it as metaphor is great, but if you believe all the stories, to me, it seems very, very, very childish and immature. But then the shift is to nature. Now we see God in nature, and I do see the wonders of nature, obviously enjoying everything, the ocean, the mountains, going all over the world, seeing everything. But when you really understand science, then you understand nature, and you see how it is. Why is there snow? When it snows? What's happening? The rain, the mountains, the oceans, all of it can be understood through intellectual scientific study. So where do you keep, and then I'm having a conflict between the wonders of nature and seeing God in nature. That's great. But basically, the more you learn, the more you study, you understand nature. Like he gave the example of becoming pregnant, an egg and a sperm, and it makes a baby. It isn't God and coming down into the womb of the woman, but yet when you know he's a science, he's a doctor, right? So he understands how that happens. I mean, it's still miraculous that it happens, but you still know scientifically exactly how that happens. So how do you keep the sense of God's wonder in nature when you really understand scientifically everything that happens in nature?
So, we've been going for 2 years through every day getting another interpretation of what to do about this disease. And it's driving us nuts, how many shots and how to prevent it, how to, masks, and aside from all the political aspects of it, yes, there's science that we're watching evolve, but on some level, it's wondrous. That's what the whole. It's miraculous because what the scientists are dealing with is trying to uncover some sort of order to get control of this disease. That God gave us minds, not just for philosophy, but minds that can come up with means to work toward our health. So on some level, yes, learning these rules is okay, is mundane, is scientific, but it's every revelation is sort of a new the other term that Heschel used was radical amazement. It's amazing that that the scientists can reveal new things every single day. So I think that's what it is. Yes, on some level, think of it as mundane but there's something really religiously important in all of that. David?
So that what Barbara said is exactly the point of departure, and why Spinoza excoriates Maimonides by name in his writings. And Spinoza equates nature with God. He says he sees them as coextensive.
Well, so what is his critique?
I'm sorry?
What is his critique? What is Spinoza's critique of Maimonides?
Well, what he says is that Maimonides makes a leap. He defines God in such a way that God is essentially nature. Now, he strongly objects to the notion about miracles. He says there's really no evidence for miracles other than what's stated in the Bible. These things make no sense. He really argues that the Bible didn't come into existence until the time of Ezra, and he provides a lot of linguistic analysis to reach that. But he takes on Maimonides by saying that science has the answer. Knowledge is the answer. And this is where Maimonides comes up short. He says the mitzvot are primarily political instruments by which the Mosaic state could exist and separate itself from other states that existed at the time.
Yeah, and Maimonides, we'll see later on with the mitzvot, Maimonides wanted rational explanations for each of the mitzvot, where there's no rational explanation. So Maimonides went ahead and explained, I assume we're going to get to that, explain kashrut in terms of health. Where that falls down, of course, is there are an awful lot of people who don't keep kosher, who are just as, if not healthier, than those of us who do keep kosher. So we've sort of given up that idea that the kosher laws have anything to do with health. Okay, we'll have. So this idea of the relationship of God to nature, if God is nature or God is the source of nature, I think from Aristotle, God is the source of nature. God is the prime mover, the one who set everything in motion. We're dealing religiously with conflict with where literalists are the people who speak for religion today. And it's very frustrating that whether the issue is homosexuality or the issue is abortion, right? They're coming from a literalist view of or other issues, a literalist view of the biblical text. This is what the Bible teaches. And what is, I think, refreshing is to hear that even already in the 12th century, Maimonides is saying, we start with the truth. How we get to the truth is a big question. We start with the truth, and now we will impose the truth on the text. That's a very radical idea to do that consciously. And I think many of us, most of us do that. And I think even in the Orthodox world, I had an argument with a cousin that lives in Israel who was visiting here. And I couldn't believe this was a very sophisticated woman, Orthodox, observant, very sophisticated. She was an optometrist or dentist herself. And she wanted to tell me that the world was 6,000 years old. I said, Katie, you can't possibly believe that. We ended the argument, we ended the discussion sort of where she is today, I don't know. But I was shocked that this otherwise modern, sophisticated person would say something like that. I think somebody mentioned Harold Schulweis earlier, that Harold Schulweis said, you cannot leave your rational mind behind when you enter the synagogue. You come to the synagogue with a rational mind, you have to bring your rational mind into the synagogue as well. Okay, it's 11 o'clock. We're going to enter Torah. Should we, which starts on page 93, should we take on 2 chapters this week or 1? Let me suggest, okay, I see Barbara putting up 2 fingers, either that or 2 fingers, either that or as a sign of victory. So we'll attempt to do both chapter 6 and 7 next week. All right, everyone have a good week.
Yeah, thanks,
Good.
Rabbi. Can you go ahead and transfer the,
Yes, just tell me how to do this again. Go to participants. Go to
participants?
right, participants, and there it's. What will I find?
It should just say co-host. If you linger over, like under the participants, if you, I think,
Go over your name.
yeah, if you go over my name and there should be more.
More. Yes, got it.
Make host, yeah.
And now make host, make co-host, make host. Got it.
Great,
Okay.
thank you, Rabbi.
All right. Have a good week, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks,
You too.
Rabbi.
Take care. Thank you.
David, I'm curious. I don't know if it was you that mentioned about the audience, like who he was writing for with the Guide to the Perplexed. And you're on mute, so take yourself.
You can just stay off mute. That's fine.
Yeah, just stay off mute from now on.
I would hope the vaccine would take care of that problem, but it doesn't. Right at the beginning, I think there's the very beginning of the guide, where this guide is apparently a presentation or letter, essay to student Joseph. And he says that what's contained here is really something that most people, the Am Haaretz, if you will, wouldn't understand. And that's the basis. As I say, there's a long history of commentary as to who this the guide, to whom the guide is addressed. If you get a copy of the translation that Goodman uses, there are 2 introductory essays. One is by Leo Strauss, a political philosopher, and his contention is that what the guide contains, if you read between the lines, is really very different from the kind of Judaism that's, if you will, based on mitzvot, based on the Mishnah Torah, which is really a summary, if you will, of Jewish law analyzed through the Talmud. Strauss has been criticized for that, but that's an aside. And I think there's a tradition that the Merkavah, the Chariot, and Bereshit should not be taught to anyone less than 40. And I think Maimonides is saying this is a tough subject. And unless you want to, we live in the 20th century, and our appreciation of science is much, much different from what it was 8-9 centuries ago. People believed in witches, people believed in magic, astrology. That's one of Maimonides' issues. He takes astrology apart. And I think Maimonides is saying we got to look to science and understand that our understanding of the Torah can no way conflict with science. If science is true, we have to understand the Torah as being a part of truth. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.
I,
guess it was-
I don't think there's a reconciliation.
I was wondering what was he the first one really to kind of look at and try to establish other truths outside of, it seems the Talmudic rabbis were going through, and any deviations, any interpretations and midrashim that they did was based on a very robust sort of focus on what the meanings of the words were and how they were used and how they could reinterpret them, but still within the context of Torah. Was
Well,
Maimonides someone who first brought in philosophy and science, and were there other examples before him that tried to do this?
Sadia, a couple centuries earlier, used logic to defend the Torah, a very rigorous logic. And Ibn Ezra, I think he was before Maimonides, I'm not sure, raised a series of questions about how Moses could have been the author of the Torah. And he pointed out conflicts, I think, in the story of Bereshit, whether there's one story of creation or whether there are two. And he pointed out other conflicts, but I really don't know, but I don't think anybody took it head on as Maimonides did. I just don't know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, the whole idea of, I think we've had this discussion before, but learning over time that, if I think about kids, that we're having kids prepare for their bar and bat mitzvah at the same time that they're going through a lot of exposure to a lot of different things. And there seems to be this point where they just say, okay, well, yeah, I've learned it. I've done what I need to do, but I don't get this at all. I can't put it in the context of, what I'm learning at school. And maybe a school like PJA helps them kind of reconcile that religion. And I don't know, but the idea of pursuing knowledge seems really key. And I have to say that as I was reading the Torah, you're reading it with what we know today and saying, really? It says this, the manna comes down. Okay. All right. I guess I'll just accept that, because I don't know how else to, it doesn't fit with rational, it doesn't logically fit that food just randomly fell from the sky every day and a double portion on Friday so that they could have two, so as an adult, I just kind of give up and say, I'm just going to accept it and move on.
But doesn't it, if you, based on Maimonides and who we are today, isn't it a matter of how you accept it? Do you accept it as verbatim truth, or do you accept it as a parable, or do you accept, or as a, that there were sort of half truths in it? I think that what we have today is a range of ways to interpret that may not, I don't know enough about the Orthodox community. I know that they debate issues, but it seems to me there's often a hard line. I think that we as conservative Jews, or whatever type of Jew we identify as, have given ourselves the leeway to interpret in different ways, but we all wrestle with it, right? We're all Jacob in some ways. And I guess it's sort of, for me, from your comments, raises the question of, what do we think is the essence of being a Jew, and what is the essence of our tradition for us? I don't know the answer, but those are the questions it raises for me.
I guess it seems like a lot of our, at least in the earlier sort of in the biblical times that we study in the Torah, there's a lot of contingency in terms of your belief in God and belief in the miracles and the execution of miracles is what will then lead to the behavior that God is asking from us. So if you take some of those miracles out, as we sort of done in some of this studying, what does that mean? How does that translate? First of all, why did the people then feel the need to keep coming back to the religion, keep coming back to observing God's mitzvot? Why did we do this if the supernatural, if those things did not occur to compel that behavior? So it's hard to reconcile some of the origins of the religion and how it's endured with some of the more modern scientific and philosophical interpretations. I mean, that's part of the struggle that I deal with.
Jennifer, I think it's very timely that you bring up bar and bat mitzvah kids and what their understanding of Judaism is. And I'm going to ask Eddie what is discussed with that age group. It's Mensches and Mavens. I'm going to ask my Mensch next time we talk, which is next week. Because I think it's a pivotal point in their lives. And there are many people in our family who are involved in camping, Jewish camps. And I think that that's a very critical time for kids to connect with Judaism. But I think in this day and age, it's really important for kids to discuss where their feelings are and why are they Jewish and why do they want to be Jewish as they continue growing. Okay, that's one topic I wanted to talk about. The other topic is things that are beshert. They may not be miracles, but I haven't been able to really grasp and understand that. For example, my husband and I were fixed up by a lady who didn't know either of us. She just heard about us. And it turned out that our families knew each other before I was born. It turned out, I'm giving you the real 5-second story. My mother-in-law's cousin named me. I wear my mother-in-law's mother's diamond. These are not miracles. To me, they're beshert. They were meant to happen. And how they happened, it's not science. It's not philosophy. It's not religion, but it happened. And we have a word for it, beshert. It was meant to be, or made in heaven, or whatever. I don't understand that, but I think that it's a topic of this century to grapple with. Any thoughts?
So kind of redefining what miracle means a little bit. I mean, because I think I really do go out in nature and I am in awe.
I do too.
I on a very basic level, it's just awe-inspiring.
Yes, I agree.
But that's with one side of my brain, and the other side of my brain is I can look at things and understand a little bit about how they work, and but I'm willing to let some of that other stuff go to be able to be emotional in that space. And maybe for me, maybe that's what it comes down to, is that unlike who was it you mentioned, the guy who was saying through me,
Harold Stoy.
yeah, that I am willing to leave everything else behind and go into a synagogue and just be
Mhm.
emotional and just be willing to say, I'll, I'm going to listen.
There are kernels of truth for sure in the Torah. But if you think about how to make it relevant, going to the point of the kids, it always has to be brought to the reality that the kids face every day. And honestly, that is the lesson that we're getting out of this book, and probably why it became a bestseller in Israel, is you're always looking for how to contextualize, this religion issue with what you see every day and what your experience is every day. And I think that that's the reality we all face. I don't necessarily think that I could argue in good conscience that God made manna fall from heaven, or that he gave Moses a stick that would bring water from a rock. I just don't think I could ever get there, nor could I get to believing the world is only 6,000 years old when you got, proof that things existed 100,000 years ago or more. So to me, you have to always bring yourself and where you're at into the experience of being Jewish. It doesn't anywhere lessen the spirituality or beauty of it. I think that's there. Sometimes it needs a little prodding to come out, and sometimes your disbelief can overwhelm you. But I think it's there, and I think that is the beauty that we all have. And then when you look into the eyes of your spouse or your child or your parent, and you see that spark in there, there's something to this. Even if you can't go through the difficult proof mechanism that Maimonides tried to go through to say what that thing is, it's there. There's no question about it. Same way with Lori and the things she talked about. Yeah, those things really happened, and they happened in her mind for a reason. They may have been totally random, but they made a heck of a lot of sense and a heck of a lot of meaning to her. And therefore they have to, in her mind, have, some Basharic purpose. But they could have been totally random, and none of us are going to be able to prove otherwise. So we have to find those pieces that give us meaning. And I really think that's what we do when we walk into shul. Some people want to be more literal about it. Some people are willing to suspend belief. That's fine. Some people bring their skepticism into it. I'll raise my hand. But you find the beauty in it. You find the lesson in it that can make your life more meaningful. So that's how I would respond to all that.
Yep, David.
Did you want to say something?
I'm signing off.
Okay,
Or
bye.
signing off. Bye, David.
Bye.
I think we're all gonna.
I think when Barbara was talking about, her relationship with nature, and it made me think there is that other piece of it, putting you in the world, so what do you do in the world? Do you go out in nature and say, well, this is just mine to trash? Or do you go out in the world? Are relationships mine to destroy? Are people, something that I can, being able to look at either people or things or situations as more uplifting. I think, Alan, I'm agreeing with you that being able to uplift those experiences a little bit more is where religion comes in and helps us guide our lives, because being able to go in nature and just say, yeah, it's awe-inspiring is great, but bringing a little bit something else to it makes it even better.
That's a lot of the spiritual piece of it. There's a lot of prescriptive sort of behavioral pieces of what's described and what we're supposed to be doing. There's a big portion of our religion as well. And it doesn't always seem in some of this discussion like we're giving that equal weight. And I don't know if we should or we shouldn't, but I'm just saying that you can't look at either piece in isolation. I don't think you can just say there's a spiritual component where we're in awe and we see all the beauty and the wonders of nature. When we have so many things that are outlined in terms of what we're supposed to be doing.
Have you read ahead?
Jews.
Mark, have you read ahead? Have you read the Torah piece?
I have not read it. No.
Okay. Read the Torah piece.
Yeah, does that
It
come out more in there?
it may raise questions, but it will give you his answer to it at least.
Okay.
Read the Torah piece. It's not that long. You can get
Yeah.
through those chapters and you'll get a better sense of where he was at
Okay.
in
Good.
trying to take a rational approach to it.
Okay. Good. Is that where he kind of reconciles the Mishnah Torah?
Yeah. I mean, and David might still say he doesn't quite square the circle, but
yeah.
But I mean, I think that's where he tries to do it. You know, my assumption based on what I knew about Maimonides coming into this is that Micah Goodman does a pretty good job of describing it, including describing where people have, you know, the most heartburn with all of it, because there is heartburn, right?
Right.
I mean, you know, but that's the infantilizing piece, right? I mean, we can think of God as, you know, having a long flowing beard and sitting on a throne, or even having, you know, the chariot and all the things that the prophets talk about in their visions. But at the end of the day, that doesn't really resonate with our experience of it.
Right.
So it falls apart, and particularly for the kids, it falls apart. I mean, it's the same issue, honestly, that Israel faces with kids that we're raising in the United States of America. They don't view it through that same lens, and the value that they think should be there when they're not met by a Jewish state really cause the problems that you see on the college campuses.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same issue. It's just, you know, and I don't disagree with Lori. I think that by the time kids get to bar and bat mitzvah age, they've got a brain, and that brain can be fed some of this, so that they have an understanding of how to have an adult version of how to interpret things.
Yeah, I
It's just
agree. I think that's crucial.
The conservative movement doesn't agree on what that is, right? Each rabbi would have to do their own thing.
Yeah.
But that's the reality is you'd be helping the kids to see the beauty of Judaism if you did open up to them, as opposed to them having them come to the conclusion this is a bunch of hooey as they get to be 18, 20 years old.
Yeah, because I think we lose a lot that way. Not that they stop identifying as Jews, but they may stop being willing to identify what might be out there that's miraculous and above it all, if that's what their belief will be. But I think you can reject a lot of it. I think we also, well, my background is, my first degree was in history, and I believe in sticking things in historical context. And so I think that with some of the early stories, if you don't take them literally, then it's helpful to try to put them in the context of, and I know I'm not an expert on this at all, but what were the beliefs in the Middle East at the time? What was floating around in the cultural milieu? What were the people who wrote this down reacting to, and what were their goals? And I don't think that even if you have that approach, it negates the possibility of God or divine inspiration, but it makes it so at least part of it, the part that I know about is a little more understandable. Many different creation stories, a lot of them seem to have floods. We took one and we came up with some different approaches to the flood that didn't quite mesh, but got stuck together in the book. That's sort of how I see it. Everybody can see it differently, but that's what works for me. And I think that
So if
for
you're
our
looking,
kids who are really quite educated in many ways, in ways that we were not growing up, the world is so different. We need to entertain the possibility of different points of view at an earlier age. And if they're going through bar and bat mitzvah, they should be discussing these different points of view too. Maybe they are, I just don't know.
so if you're up to another 45 minutes a week, I suggest you find Ed Feinstein, who's the rabbi at Valley Beth Shalom. He does a weekly Torah study, and it's on YouTube under Valley Beth Shalom, the Torah study. He does a Torah study, and he's been doing it for the last 3 years or so with the Reform rabbi who was in the God Squad, Mark, I forget his last name. Anyhow, they do this give and take, and they go, right through the myth and right to the tachlis of what this is about and how to make this relevant to today's life. It's really good. And
It's called Valley Beth Shalom.
Valley Beth Shalom is the name of the synagogue, and it's their YouTube site, and it's Torah study. And if you go there, they do it. They do it either on Friday or they do it Saturday morning before services. But it's up there, every Saturday, and you can find back ones. If you're interested in a particular parsha, you can find that one. But just start listening to it. It's a fascinating conversation.
Good.
Thank you.
All right.
All right, guys, have a
A
good
new
week.
assignment.
Yeah, have a
Yeah.
good week. Great
Take
to
care.
see you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.